I resented football for a long time. I wouldn't even watch college football games. Like I didn't keep up with the NFL at all. And in the moment, I didn't notice it, but as I look back, I think it was a bit of a resentment for the way my body felt after having finally hung the cleats up.
Welcome back to Coats in Conversation. I'm your host, Kendrique Coats. Before we begin today's conversation, be sure to like and subscribe to Coats in Conversation wherever you are listening to this episode. This truly helps me grow what I am doing, and it also helps you stay up to date on when I release new podcast episodes. All podcast episodes can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or whatever platform you use to listen to podcast episodes. In today's awesome conversation, my guest is my longtime childhood friend, Chase Alford. Interestingly, our relationship actually started off with some tension, which we discuss in this episode. At the beginning of this conversation, Chase shares how he grew up to love the game of football and his transition from high school to competing at the Division II level. The middle part of this conversation, we discuss one of the major injuries that significantly made Chase question his outlook on sports and the struggles he had finding his own identity. As we wrap up this conversation, we discuss what Chase is involved in now, how his sports skills have served him in his current roles, and advice to athletes who are struggling to find their identity after sports. I truly hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Chase, how you doing today?
My man, Kendrick, it's good to see you. I'm doing well. How are you?
Man, I can't complain. I was thinking about it the other day. I think it was at the beginning of the pandemic where we would have kind of bi-weekly check-ins, and we were talking about books, different things that we were interested in. And we spent a lot of time talking about real estate and thinking about properties. And so I mean, many of our conversations, we could have probably gone back and recorded those and turned those into podcast episodes because the depth at which we were talking on many of these topics, I mean, people could probably gain some information around that. So I always enjoy the conversations that we have because you bring this sense of depth, which I think a lot of times just having general conversations with folks, at least for me, I'm always looking, how deep into conversation we can get into. So it's always great talking to you, man. It's good to see you.
Absolutely, man. And to your point, I think especially during the pandemic, it was nice to, even though everybody was pretty isolated and in their homes, it was nice to have a space to kind of bounce different ideas and talk dreams and plans and things like that. So I certainly appreciated those times,
For
and
sure.
of course our longtime friendship.
Absolutely. Goes way back. Before we get started in the episode, do you remember? I think it was in high school. I don't know if you remember this, but we were outside of the locker room. And I think you were a freshman at the time. I may have been a senior, or maybe this was camp. I don't remember what it was, but I remember there was a little bit of tension between us two. For those that don't know, Chase and I, we were star athletes in our high school, and so there was tension, I think maybe on my part, or maybe there was made up tension just competition wise, and you came up to me and we just kind of hashed it out. We're like, hey man, there's no bad blood here. And I think that's really what was the catalyst to our friendship, of just kind of like, hey man, like we both want to be great at what we do. So yeah, we go way back, man.
Yeah, I I vaguely remember. I remember coming up in junior high though, and Kendrick was a star. Kendrick was the guy that everybody talked about. So I think from my perspective, coming in freshman year, I simply just wanted to help fill the shoes of the star when his time was over. So we may get into it in the discussion here, but you certainly were one of the first people I can think back and say he truly was a mentor to me. So
Man,
again,
I appreciate that. No,
appreciate
I
that. Yeah.
I appreciate you. So, to kick off the episode today, for the first question, for the people who don't know you, tell us a little bit about where you're from, and was collegiate football even a goal for you when you were younger?
Sure. So I grew up in Pontiac, Illinois, same place as you, of course. There was one year where I spent a little bit of time in Metamora. I believe that was second grade, but the majority of my upbringing was in Pontiac. Played football from the age of 8 all the way up through college, which I'll get into. Um, I was always a three sport athlete. I played football, of course, but also ran track and played basketball pretty much from the age of 8, 9, 10 years old, again up through graduation. Um, and from a young age, those days of playing in JFL, and I think my dad played a big part in that. My dad was always sort of my football coach, but he was one that always instilled confidence in me, told me I could achieve whatever I wanted. I remember growing up and watching Reggie Bush play for USC, and I would talk about how good he was and how I only wished to be that good. And whether or not it was the case, I don't think it was the case, but my dad was always the first person to say, Chase, you can do everything he can do. And so I think when I was really young, I did want to go play college football. And to be honest, there was a long time where I held on to the dream of making the NFL one day. So college was always certainly on the radar. I eventually graduated high school, and prior to graduation, I had signed my letter of intent with McKendree University.
Going from, you spent some time, you had mentors looking up to Reggie Bush. Your dad kind of gave you the motivation that you could do anything that you wanted. So
Hmm.
taking your experience from, high school and kind of cultivating a space where you had dreams and aspirations to signing your letter of intent to McKendree, collegiate ball is a big shift in mentality and physically as well. So especially with the number of responsibilities you're given, what was the
Hmm.
team culture like surrounding mental health as you dealt with that shift? And the reason why I bring that up is because, as our primary um, conversation today is around athlete mental health, but I ask that because I think there are many athletes who go from high school sports to collegiate sports, and it's just a completely different shift. So again, going back
Hmm.
to my original question, what was, collegiate ball was a big shift in mentality and from a physical perspective, but what was the team culture around mental health?
So you're right. It is a big shift. Probably even bigger than most expect. I think the biggest difference is the amount of time it consumes. Right, like in high school, you're busy from whenever summer camp starts up to the end of the football season, which typically is, if you make your playoffs sometime in October, maybe November, if you make it really deep. College football is different. College football, you're showing up maybe middle of the summer, you're starting camp. You obviously have the season and this and that, but there's this thing called spring ball, and starting at some point in February, March, you start getting together as a team, watching film, early morning workouts, this and that, and then you practice as if you're in season. I mean, at some point, you put on the pads, you're hitting each other, knocking each other around. You have the spring game, so very, very time consuming. And I would say even between the end of the regular season and spring ball, you're still meeting and going through workouts and this and that. So for me, I think that was a huge shift. And even though I had played basketball and track in high school and was used to being busy with extracurriculars, it being football and the wear and tear that I think you receive, I think was something I had to get used to and very quickly. And so, from a mental health perspective, back then, were there resources available to kind of talk through that shift, how to manage your time effectively, how to, um, I guess, in some ways, preserve your body and take care of your body? There may have been some of those resources around. And I think, unfortunately, at that point in my life and at that age, 18, 19, I just may not have had my priorities in the right order. And so, whether or not they were there, again, I'm not 100% certain, but I don't think I was seeking them the way that I should have to be able to have made that transition as effective as possible.
Yeah, and that's a good point that you bring up because I think back when, we were competing in sports, it was at a time where concussions, that was just kind of you got your bell rung, sit out for a few plays, go back in. So going back, there's been this huge evolution with athlete mental health, but then also different ways of taking care of our bodies. And so I was similar when I was competing at the collegiate level as well. I don't recall any resources. But again, my mindset was like, okay, academics, practice, eating. And so, you know, do you remember at that time, were there, any specific mental health struggles? And if you did have any, did you feel comfortable about speaking to anybody about those?
I thinking back, like in the moment, it may not have been as big of a deal as I now look back and see that it could have been. I think other than adapting and getting used to this new lifestyle and um, how time consuming it was, it really felt like a job. But the other thing that is kind of a smack of reality, I guess, is that when you go to the next level, depending on where you play, D3, 2, 1, whatever, um, the competition is the jump in competition is sort of crazy. And so while I was playing at a Division 2 school, arguably, and I think a lot of my teammates would agree, I think we had a lot of D1 talent walking around that team, and for whatever reason, be it high school injury or undersize, they didn't they didn't make their dream of making it D1, and so um, very quickly, I was one of, I think, five other running backs that they had recruited that freshman year, and these kids are coming from 7A, 8A schools. These guys are also all staters. And so while I was an all state running back in high school at Pontiac, which at the time was like 4 or 5A, these guys were every bit as good. Many of them were faster. We each had like unique skill sets. So I think one of the things I might have struggled with back then was trying to understand my role in the team. I had been so used to sort of being the guy at Pontiac. I knew I was going to get 30 carries a game. And going in freshman year, it's humbling because you have not only freshmen that are just as skilled in many ways, but you also have all the upperclassmen that are taking a lot of reps. So I certainly spent a good amount of time on the sidelines. I don't, other than sort of talking with my parents, and maybe at the time it was me venting instead of finding a way to work my way onto the field. I think that was my outlet to sort of talk about it, but I still wasn't looking at it through the lens of like, how am I coping with how this is affecting me mentally, right?
Yeah. And just that piece of being thrown into a new environment, not being the man, to what's my role here, and being
Mhm.
able to conceptualize all of those things and process that information of like, did somebody forget about me? Am I not good enough? So did you have any type of doubts as far as what you could do? Because again, you got put into this environment and you're having to fight your way for maybe to get notice from coaches or to get any type of play time. Did you ever doubt yourself and wanting to stick with it?
I don't. This sort of goes back to what I was saying about my dad and instilling confidence in me. I don't know that I ever lost the confidence, uh, or thought that I didn't have the ability. And funny enough, it was we had those other freshman running backs that again I'll continue to go back and say I felt like they were just as skilled. The one thing they had that I don't think I really did a lot was coach asked for a running back and they would sprint out there, right? Like they were going to fight for their reps and they were going to make sure that they got in front of coach's eyes. And I always took the approach of like, hey, um, I'm not here to try and take opportunities away from somebody. Like I want to win the battle, but I'm not going to go to the point where I'm going to take 7 reps and give you 2, right? Like I'm going to take my 4 reps, you're going to take your 4 reps, and whoever performs better is going to be the guy that gets on the field. And so I think I always thought I was capable, and in a lot, I did get a lot. I did get quite a bit of playing time my freshman year, but I don't think I ever really lost confidence that I wasn't able to compete. I feel like I just had to sit back and wait my turn, and that was the hardest part that I had to deal with. Was well, when is my turn, right? I feel like I'm um, proving myself day in and day out, but when you're at the next level, again, you sometimes you just have to wait your turn.
So kind of diving deeper into that. So as you're competing at this level and eventually finding your role, for those that don't know, you suffered some injuries, and which sidelined you. What were you going through, or what thoughts were going through your mind when, you got at a place to where it's okay, I'm figuring out this space, and then injury. Tell us about what was going through your mind.
Yeah, I think this is where it sort of got tough. This is when I started to question just how much longer I was going to be able to play the sport, which um, was a sport that I had loved since I was young. And again, I told you for a while I was sort of hanging on to the idea of, oh, well, maybe I'll make the NFL. I think once I got to college, I felt like that was a little out of reach. But at that point, I was playing for the fun of it. And I wanted to go out there and compete. And so, my freshman year, towards the end of the season, I was starting to get a lot more reps. As a team, we didn't perform great. It was a tough first year within Division Two. I think we won two, maybe three football games that year. And so, you get towards the end of the year, the coaches start to get some of the younger guys some playing time, guys that are going to be around for the next couple of years. So I was getting quite a few carries, was feeling really confident with what my future was going to look like at McKendree, sophomore, junior, senior year. And then, funny enough, the very last game of my freshman year, the fourth quarter, there's like 3 or 4 minutes left. It was one of the two or three games that we won. We're up on these guys by like 3 touchdowns. We're just simply running the ball out. I take a sweep up the left sideline, get tackled from the side, land on my shoulder, and bust my collarbone. Completely breaks off in two parts. Ended up having surgery and had to take most of that off season off just to recover. So I missed a lot of the workouts. I was still part of all the film sessions, but I think at that point it was the first time I had sustained a big. It was the first time I'd ever broken anything. Like I had dealt with muscle, hamstring related stuff, some back issues, but I never really dealt with anything breaking. So I think it was a bit of a wake up call that you are at the next level. You're not, your body is not injury proof, and so as I sort of worked to recover over the season between freshman and sophomore year, it was okay. What can I be doing extra? Whether it's some form of prehab, diet, working out smarter to make sure that I stay nice and healthy. Jump into sophomore year, first game of the season, I get a carry up the middle. Our lineman must have been doing an awesome job on that play because there was nobody within sight except a free safety who was about 15 yards back. And mind you, I'm only 175 pounds, nothing huge, but I take the stance that I'm going to try and run this guy over. Like no juking. It's the first game of the season. Let me set the tone. I'm going to run him over. So I lower my other shoulder, which is the healthy one, and I thought I broke my collarbone on that exact play. Ended up jogging off to the side, tell the training staff, hey, I might have just broke my other collarbone because I'd never really experienced pain like that other than when I broke the collarbone, last game of freshman year. Turns out it was a like joint separation, and so it sidelined me for a few weeks. Um, but I was really feeling down in the dumps at that point. Right? Can I keep playing football? Do I want to keep playing football? Is it worth the injury and the pain that I may experience after this? So I think that was sort of a pivotal point in my college career, my sports career.
Dealing with injuries, it's one of those things that it's inevitable in any sport that we play. And having to, you came off of recovering from one injury, starting the next season, and you dealt with another injury. So there's like a level of, as the universe, what's going on? You had in your mind, I'm sure, this is going to be a successful season. I know in the past,
Mhm.
for others that aren't aware of it, you sustained another injury, from what I remember, and that was a complete pivot in how you viewed the sport and what you were going to do. Can you kind of go into that?
Yeah. So freshman and sophomore year, I dealt with the two shoulder injuries. Junior year came around. It was an okay season, but for anybody who is familiar, and I alluded to earlier, I have always sort of had some spinal issues, some herniated discs, things like that. And at this point in my career, whether it be getting sort of beat up on the field or this or that, um, I felt like it was affecting my everyday life. I was waking up with back pain. I was getting a lot of shooting pain down my legs, some sciatica, and so I made the proactive decision to opt for back surgery at the end of my junior season. So I think it was like the December after my third year season ended. So um, again, proactive. I was operating day to day just fine, but it was when I was in the gym lifting weights or when I was playing football, I was getting a lot of pain, and so again, just made that decision. And I think that was truly when I decided that it was probably time for me to hang it up. Right, like the NFL dream was completely dead. I was enjoying the sport, but I sort of had to weigh the pros and cons.
Which is something that a lot of athletes deal with is how much more pain, suffering, where's the tolerance at for another injury? And so one of the, I think of some of the athletes that go through ACL injuries and they go
Mm.
through their surgery and come back. Given that it was your back, that's that's pretty scary. I mean, especially when you're starting to talk about a herniated disc, having back surgeries. So, did you know in that moment when you were getting surgery, was that pretty much like, yeah, I'm done with this?
Yeah, I figured that was it. And I think I was okay with that decision. After the two shoulder surgeries, I think that sort of framed my mind for am I going to play a full 4 seasons? Um, do I want to make the jump and for the first time in my life just be a student versus a student athlete? So I did make that decision, but with that said came, I guess, a bit of an identity crisis. Right, my entire life I had been sort of referred to as the football guy, junior high, high school, even in college, right? Like I wouldn't say I was the guy on campus, but McKendree was a small enough school that, I mean, maybe 1,500 kids and 80% of the campus played sports, right? So, while I wasn't the football guy, I was a football guy amongst a team of football players. And, we had women's basketball, men's basketball, we had volleyball teams, we had lacrosse teams. Everybody played a sport. And so for me, it was almost sort of weird to, for the first time in my life, say, oh, I don't play football. I used to play football. I used to be a football player. And so I had to take quite a bit of time to try and figure things out. And I'd love to explore that topic a little more. But I will say, from those surgeries and eventually making the decision to stop playing or not play my last year, right? I only missed out on one year. Um, I resented football for a long time. I wouldn't even watch college football games. Like I didn't keep up with the NFL at all. And in the moment, I didn't notice it, but as I look back, I think it was a bit of a resentment for the way my body felt after having finally hung the cleats up.
It's kind of like one of those things, something that has been so consistent, something you wake up and it's there. You have practice most cases Monday through Friday, maybe a game on Saturday
Hmm.
or Monday through Thursday in high school, games on Friday. And as I can feel where you're coming from because I think we've had conversations about this, when people would come up, oh yeah, number so and so, like, and they would bring up football memories. And in our prior conversations, we talk about how upset or mad that we would get that people kept on talking to us about football. But it sounds like there was an element of kind of separating yourself from something that maybe disappointed you. Not necessarily the sport, but what comes with the sport.
Yeah, I think you're right. High school, I think I had enough success, especially in high school athletics and football. Like it landed me on the front page of the PTHS Holiday Classic. And for what reason, I have no idea. I played basketball, but I was not the basketball guy. I wasn't even the best guy on our team. So I have a number of different theories, but I think just simply having, it was my senior year that I was on the cover of the holiday tournament, the basketball tournament. And mind you, we have teams like Simeon and guys like Derrick Rose played in that league. Like you know, um, but I had enough success at Pontiac playing football that I was getting like different features and stuff in like the Bloomington papers, and so I would go to Bloomington for different things. Like at one point, I had an internship at State Farm in Bloomington in the IT department. I was studying computer science and everything at the time, and people at State Farm would loosely know my name, but knew I was like the football guy. And in some ways, it was flattering and I guess nice that people recognized you, but at some point, I certainly started to adopt the mindset of like, I'm much more capable of anything than carrying a football, right? So to your point, I think after a little while, it certainly got frustrated. And, I had looked at some of my peers who had also played sports, but they were looked at as people who were going to go on to be accountants or teachers, or people were starting to look to them like, oh, this is what you're going to do in the future. And for me, it was just, well, you were the football guy that was all state, right? So, yeah, I think after a little while, I sort of got burnt out on only being recognized as that guy.
And I think many athletes have, I can't speak for everybody, but for since you and I have had conversations prior to this podcast on, it's like, okay, I did this one thing. I was an athlete at one point, one phase of my life, but that's not who my whole being is. And I think for
Hmm.
us and some of the conversations that we've had, it's like, what do we need to do for other people to see us for more than an athlete? Yeah, we had our
Hmm.
shine on Friday night lights and, Saturdays playing football, but what do we need to do for other people to recognize us as, Chase Alford or Kendrick Coats? Like, because it's one of those things to where it's like, are we going to go our whole lives being referred to as the football guy or the athlete? So, you've kind of loosely talked about it, but how did you navigate the transition from being a college athlete to finding a new sense of identity and purpose after you retired?
I think I was quiet for a little while. I think after football, I was left with a lot of free time, and so I ended up transferring from McKendree, um, transferred to Western Illinois, where I was simply a student, and with all of my free time, I picked up a couple of part-time jobs. Like I worked at Aldi, I worked at Casey's. I was a personal trainer there for a little bit, but I sort of pivoted into becoming, I guess, what you could consider a strength athlete. Like I did some natural bodybuilding. Like I enjoyed being in the gym, and while it wasn't putting me in the exact competition I was used to, for me, it was an outlet for me to still get physical activity in and work on, my body. It gave me something to strive for, and so I think that's, from the athlete perspective, while my identity wasn't now I'm the guy that goes to the gym, I think that helped me sort of bridge the gap while I was finding other hobbies and things that I would want to be. Uh, for instance, I found reading, started reading a lot more. I had met a good buddy at McKendree who had sort of put me on to, philosophy and books in a way, but meditation and spirituality and things like that. So I was starting to toy around with a little bit of those things, and I think, um, just taking a little bit of time off, spending some time in the gym, surrounding myself with some like-minded folks, I was able to sort of make that transition. And I think also the way you refer to yourself, right? Like even now, my job is, uh, project management at a bank here in Chicago. I don't like to refer to myself as a project manager, but rather like I do project management, right? And I think, if you classify yourself in that way, like other people are going to start referring to you as, oh, he's a football player. No, he plays football, but he does a number of other things, right? He's capable of doing other things. So I think I slowly started referring to myself as, I am not any one thing. I do a number of different things and I enjoy them.
And I like the way you put that. I do X or I do such and
Hmm.
such because it's so easy and so common to basically refer to ourselves as the job that we are. So I am a builder, I am whatever the case may be. And no disrespect to anybody
Hmm.
that refers to themselves as that, but it's just the thing is words have so much power and so much meaning behind them. And so, you have a name, Chase Alford. You're not Chase your name's not project manager, and
Hmm.
so kind of one of those things separating the two. Okay, you've got who you are as a person and what you do as a living. Those are two separate things, and it's so easy, going back to sports, we'd often say, well, I play football, I'm the athlete, I'm the
Hmm.
football player. which again, I think it takes us away from our own identity of who we are as people. So, so going from basically compete collegiate level and transferring schools, finding, now you have a new life. It's just being a student and doing all of the things that come with being a student, reflecting on your journey as a former student and athlete. What have been the most valuable life lessons you've learned that go far beyond the classroom or the football field?
I think from football and just sports in general, I learned what it means to be disciplined. I learned what it means to be a good teammate, trusting others to, support you, do their job. I think communication is a big skill that you learn in football, right? I think about some of the best, using, I guess, a football analogy here, some of the best defenses we ever played against were the defenses that were constantly talking, right? Guy in motion, guy in motion. I got two receivers to the left. Like, the teams that were always talking were the teams that always seemed to be on the same page. And that same sort of communication lesson, I think, applies to my job. The pandemic has sort of forced a lot of companies into this virtual world, and I don't often see coworkers in person. There's a lot of communication via like Microsoft Teams and virtually, but I've found that the more you communicate, oftentimes even over communicating, the better everybody is kept in the loop. So I think there's a number of lessons I've certainly learned from sports, and discipline, communication, trust are three of the big ones that sort of stand out to me.
I like the way you say that as far as over communicating. And that's something that we often talk about in marriage and family therapy is not assuming that the other person, whatever they said, that we comprehended it the way they meant it to be. There's just so many
Hmm.
different nuances to language and communication that clarification, in my opinion, is your best friend because people talk. There's just so many different levels to communicating. And as you mentioned, communicating, via Microsoft Teams, people in different areas, different backgrounds, different experiences when we get into the workforce. So I like the fact that you said over communicating because I think it is one of those things that eliminates any type of guesswork in what people mean and what they're saying.
I would say, if I could add one thing, the other thing too is, I think being a good competitor is also a learned skill, right? Like, there's such a thing as, healthy and unhealthy competition. And I see in the workplace how, if perhaps you didn't have a sports background, how it could be defeating to see another coworker maybe get the promotion that you were expecting, right? And I think uh, part of healthy competition is, striving to be the best employee you can be. And while everybody is working on the same team, like, you have to take a little bit for yourself, right? Like, at the end of the day, a lot of these companies, it, they're going to pick the company over the employee sometimes, right? And so, if you were to get laid off tomorrow, or if you were to quit, that company is going to keep moving, and within a couple weeks, they may be over you. So I think there's such a thing as healthy competition in the workplace, but there's also sportsmanship, right? Congratulating others, not taking losses like a sore loser and pouting about it, right? It's, handshake, congratulations, you beat me this time around. Next time, know that I'm coming back, bigger, faster, stronger. And I think that part of sports, the lessons I learned just from those competitions, the wins, the losses I learned from each one of them, and they've made me a better employee. I think they've made me a better friend, and a better significant other to my current significant other. So.
I'm kind of curious, what did your injuries teach you about yourself?
Hmm. One, that I'm not unstoppable. Um, I think there's sometimes a period as kids where you just truly think you're indestructible, right? Like, you don't. I don't think sometimes as a kid, at least I didn't. I didn't have the maturity to know how my decisions as a child or as a teenager were going to affect me later on in life. And so I think back, all the times I went in the gym and was just trying to lift as heavy as possible. And I think I achieved some good success in the gym, but I kick myself for the way I would just walk out of the gym afterwards without stretching, without drinking water, without foam rolling. And I call myself an idiot, and that's probably a bit hard on myself, but um, I think I've learned a lot of lessons in that sense.
Yeah, and there's
I
a
don't know.
level of, kind of resiliency, and I laugh because just the fact of going in the gym, lifting a bunch of weights, not stretching, no cool, nothing. It's just kind of like we're strong, nothing can stop us. But, years later, it's like, okay, there actually needs to be some type of structure and method to why we're doing specific workouts. And there's got to be a
Hmm.
structure and method to making sure that we're taking care of our bodies. Otherwise, it doesn't typically end up well, and limping around the house, pulled muscles, whatever the case
Hmm.
may be. But
Yeah.
there's, kind of wrapping things up now. Um, there are thousands of athletes out there who have probably experienced some of the similar things you have discussed today. What advice would you give them as they navigate either retiring from their sport or finding their own purpose and identity?
I think, and this sort of ties back to the question you just asked me, but I think what my injuries were able to teach me was that I was good at a lot more things than I probably ever gave myself credit for, right? Like in many ways, I thought, I just was both naturally gifted, but I did put a lot of time into my craft, which was sports. Um, but dealing with injury and having to find new habits, reading. I wish I was writing, but uh, studying and learning about different technologies, or trying to do a little bit more running, or I was boxing for a little bit. Like there's all these different things out there, and they don't have to be athletics. Again, hobbies more so on the academic side that you probably are far better at than you think. And so, by all means, sports hold a good place in my heart, and to this day, I still enjoy watching sports competitions. And I've joined a bocce ball league here in Chicago just to give me something to compete and go out and do. But if you're considering hanging them up, right? Like I don't. It's definitely not the end of the world. I think you will find a new identity, but I would also advise not to let that specific sport become your identity in the first place, right? Like we are much more complex individuals and beings than whatever sort of hobby we're interested in at that specific time. You have a lot of time to live, and you're going to pick up a lot of things along the way.
For sure. Again, we are capable of many things. And I like, what you just provided because I think athletes out there, not all, but some athletes, it's the only thing, whether they're in a bad situation or, home life isn't as kosher as it could be. Sport lends an outlet from getting away from those things, so it's very easy to create an identity around one sport and not have anything to kind of go to other than your sport. And I like the fact that you said as far as getting into reading because it expands the way we think as human beings, and it's so important to be able to be well versed in so many different things to where one, you mentioned it earlier, being able to communicate with people. We're different, we're complex beings. Not all of us talk sport, not all of us talk financials, not all of us talk politics. But if we can have a wide variety of different things that we know about or we learn about, it does make communicating with other people much easier. And I'm sure as you being involved in project management, you learn those things. And I guess one last thing, so with the teams that you work with, have you been able to instill some of your values that you've pulled from sports into, how some of your colleagues show up?
Yeah, absolutely. The communication piece, I think I've already sort of touched on, and in my role, I work with some like data engineers and developers that work offshore, like in India, and so of course, communication is super key. Trying to get the message across, Um, but the discipline thing, and I probably didn't touch on it earlier, but sticking with your commitment or your promise, I think is huge, right? Like in sports, if I said I was going to do something and I didn't do it, coach was on me, or coach was disappointed. And I think, um, think about the times when we ran track, that 4x4, man, it's energetic. The last event of the track meet, and funny enough, I always ran my splits in the 4x4 faster than I would have ever run just the open 400, because other people are dependent on you. So if I go out there and say I'm gonna run 50 seconds, 51 seconds, and I don't do it, I'm not just letting myself down. I feel like I'm letting the team down. And so I think those are, that's another lesson I've tried to instill in some of the teams here, right? Like if you say you're going to get something done and you don't get it done, you either need to have a really good excuse, or you risk, upsetting the team, disappointing the team, and nobody wants to feel that way. And I've seen some success trying to bring my sports background to this world where some folks haven't played sports, but they understand the lesson either way.
Man, Chase, I first of all want to give you your flowers of being such an awesome human being, being such an amazing friend, and being somebody that provides value and cares about other people. I think in all of the years that I've known you, that has basically been who you are as a person, curious about life, wanting to learn about other people. So I appreciate you sharing some of your experiences and your resiliency around having an identity crisis within sports and overcoming injuries. But more importantly, I just appreciate your energy and what you're putting out into the world. I think in this day and age, it's very easy to be self-absorbed or just kind of I and not necessarily thinking about others. You're a type of person, a type of friend that is constantly thinking about other people. And I appreciate everything that you do. I appreciate you taking the time to be on this podcast because it gives a different perspective. I think a lot of people out
Hmm.
there, again, have had many of these experiences that we've gone through. But, sometimes it just takes hearing a story just one more time from a different voice. And it's like, oh, I am capable of more. And you've been able to outline that today. So, again, I appreciate you. I appreciate your friendship and I appreciate you jumping on this podcast with me today.
Thanks, man. I appreciate the kind words, and as always, man, I respect what you're doing. I respect you. And though we may not talk like we used to during the pandemic, you're still providing mentorship just from the content you're putting out. So just know that you've certainly touched my life, and I'm sure many others who may not reach out to you and thank you as much as we all should. So thanks again for having me on.
I appreciate you, man. With that being said, if you enjoyed this episode, leave a comment. What was the best part of this episode? Share this episode with somebody who may be able to benefit. We talked about a lot of things here, and I think sharing this story also provides other people with another resource to pull information from or motivation. So again, we thank you for checking out this episode today. Be sure to like and subscribe to Coats in Conversation. And until next time, we'll chat soon.